I'd like to welcome everyone, all our guests and members tonight for this ICA Speaks with Ellen Lesperance. A particularly warm welcome to you, Ellen, and thank you so much for doing this talk tonight and sharing your work with us.
You are welcome.
Before we get started, I will just briefly introduce you, and first and foremost, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank our donors and lenders who've supported this exhibition, Amazon Nights, at ICA Miami. That is in particularly Ed and Helen Nickel and the Nickel Family Fund. And tonight's Zoom, as well as all digital initiatives at ICA Miami, are supported by the generosity of the Knight Foundation. So before I leave the microphone to Ellen, I'd like to briefly introduce our guest. Ellen Lesperance was born in 1971 in Minneapolis, and she lives and works in Portland, Oregon, from where she's joining us tonight. She has had solo exhibitions at many major institutions and museums that include the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Seattle Art Museum, and her work has also been featured in numerous group exhibitions that include exhibitions at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the Sao Paulo Museum of Art, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, the Brooklyn Museum, and the New Museum in New York. In conjunction with her exhibition in Baltimore that happened in 2020, Ellen also published a book called Velvet Fist that I highly recommend, and that's also available in ICA Miami's museum shop if you're interested in buying it. Right now, there is an exhibition of Ellen's work up at the museum, Amazon Nights, throughout March 27th. So if you haven't been, please come and visit us. The exhibition is centered around a painting that is from ICA Miami's permanent collection. The piece is titled Amazon Nights, Women's Spirit, Women Power, Glory from 2017. That we were able to acquire for the museum's collections with funds provided by Helen Kent Nickel and Edward Nickel. And it's presented actually in dialogue with a piece from Robert Gober from '94 that is on long-term view in the museum's ground floor. And Ellen's exhibition is a second of this format that engages in a dialogue with this piece and complex discussions among artistic practices. The exhibition Amazon Nights, apart from the work from the collection, also features a number of new and existing paintings, as well as two new sculptures that pay homage to feminist activism, which I'm sure Ellen will talk more about tonight. One last thing before I hand over the microphone, if you have any questions for Ellen, please feel free to drop them in the chat anytime, and we will address them at the end of the talk in a Q&A. So if anything comes up, just add your questions in the chat. Thank you so much. And without further ado, welcome, Ellen.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, we're back in Zoom format. I'm like getting used to this. I think because we are in Zoom format and not in the gallery space, I wanted to do a really good job of walking you all through the exhibition and do a presentation that's based on the works in there and the works in context to each other and to this Robert Gober piece, which is in the floor, settled beneath the floor in the space permanently. So when I first found out that I was going to have this show from Stephanie, the fact that the Gober was in the space was told to me. And so it was really important for me to start thinking of that as a launching pad to organize the exhibition. I mean, Robert Gober is an important artist to me. He has been since my formative years. His work is so meticulously crafted and just haunting and uncanny. And he also has this important relationship to ACT UP work in the 1990s in relation to the AIDS crisis. And so the work is multifaceted, and in the floor of the museum and in context to my work, I started thinking about what it might conjure. I have been, for the last 15 years, maybe a little less, been looking at the work that activists make while engaged in their protests. It's called creative direct action. So it's the things that they make, the things that they wear, street theater performances, banner drops, etc., to augment their activism on site. And for the last 10 years, I've been really focused on Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, which was an anti-nuke separatist encampment in England throughout the 1980s and the 1990s. And I've been going to the UK about how many times in the last 10 years? About 6 or 7 times to visit various archives, and then also become in communication with activists that were there and also photographers that were there in order to research their private collections of materials, such as slides, such as old photographs and ephemera, and also just look through Greenham Common archives that are in more public institutions and in museums, in order to pluck from those archives my own archive. So an archive within the archive of particular type of creative direct action, which was the making of sweaters that bore messages that furthered their argumentative causes. So Greenham Common had this incredibly rich history of knitting, and at the time I found out about the gober in the floor of the space, I had just come across this image. And this activist in particular has this piece of knitwear that she's wearing that echoes formally the gober in the floor, in the sense that it doesn't have a drain, doesn't have this drain that's kind of draining a life force out, or creating a corpse-like apparition under the floor, but it's this different heart-based center over the heart that's radiating. And I started to think of that as this beautiful potential object, an image that could be placed in juxtaposition to that floor piece. So if you look at the image now, before we go forward, you see that she's wearing a sweater that looks a little oversized. Again, it has the heart motif, and then it has a radiating maybe flower, because it looks like petals on top. She has a cardigan over it that looks like there's texture. And then she also has on what looks like pants, or maybe pants under a skirt, because you can see the pants at the very bottom have this zigzag or rickrack patterning on it. And it also reminded me of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, although I'm not a religious person. It just like had that relationship. So this is the first piece that is in the gallery space that I'm going to talk about. And because I think of the relationship to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and just thinking about a female subject as opposed to the male subject under the floorboard, and also thinking about like what, in juxtaposition to my work, it seemed like it was impossible to not imagine that piece as sort of a patriarchal presence under the floor. So this piece is called Gloria, and it has, in my work, it's gouache, which is a water-based paint with really kind of rich, dense pigment, as opposed to watercolor that is pretty transparent. And what I do is, you can go back one more slide. I'm sorry, I just wanted to show a detail. You can see there are the pants that have the zigzag pattern on the bottom, and those are pant shapes that are overlapped on top of the kind of yellow colored short sleeve sweater with the emblem that I placed on the front and on the back. And then the green is the color of the cardigan that I placed over it. And all of the layers are represented as on a single plane, so that there's an illusion of transparency that needs to be maintained to see where the shapes stop and start. In the show, what I frequently do is I use the pattern that I create, the painting, as a actual generative pattern that I knit to recreate the sweater that I found in the world, and bring it back into the contemporary era. So this is the sweater that was knit using the painting that we just saw previously. And because it has two garments within it, and the image of the protester had two garments, it is kind of one within the other sweater. So, and also I was interested in displaying it in relation to the Gober, in the sense that it is in the same format of square or rectangle as the floor piece. It's the same dimensions. And then this is another detail of it. Okay, so moving to the next painting in the gallery is the one on the right that has a newspaper image on it. So this image is called Stop Men Energy Time Spectacular, and this is another pattern for a Greenham Common sweater that I found. Oh, this is a detail. So you can see in this, it's the front and the back of a garment that has a newspaper motif, and then it has a sleeve and another sleeve that are over each other. So that's where those V shapes come from. When I was researching Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp at the Women's Library, a special archive at the London School of Economics, I came across this image of an activist, and she's wearing a newspaper themed garment. And there was a slew of these kind of novelty newspaper sweaters in the 80s. And I began to research them, but this particular sweater says stop on the back, and then it says spesh. And so there's no novelty sweater, and I've been looking for years, that has that configuration on the back. So it left, well, there's a few windows that this opens for me. One is that it's in black and white, and so there's a way that it needs to be translated, its value structure, imagining like what particular colors comprise that garment, and then also what it said, what that activist wanted to stop, what she wanted everyone to know that she wanted to stop when she walked out into the world. And none of the sweaters that I found have any of that stop or spesh on either side of them. So my belief is that she followed the patterning, or used one of these as an inspiration for her own recreation. So I did a series of paintings based on what I imagined that stop and spesh might represent. So in this one, it gets translated into stop men, and then the spesh becomes spectacular. So it's stop men energy time spectacular. Yes, and then this one, it's stop war first priority. And so this one becomes stop war, and then it's special. So it's special edition. And all of them have different type that's based on the source image that I found in the archive, and then also on the sweaters themselves. So the sweaters themselves have a lot of language about the days of the weeks in the cities. And then also they all have an image. So imagining the image that might have been included. And then this one is Stop Nuke Special. And then there were, I believe, 3 additional ones. I wanted to flesh this project out a little bit more. So moving around the room from the Gloria painting that has the relationship to the Gober in the floor formally and conceptually is a rainbow sweater painting called You Talk of Revolution, I Wonder What You See, from 2020. And one of my interests in recording the garments from Greenham Common is to track their use of symbols. So this is the source image for that garment, I'm sorry, for that pattern. And you can see that there's a camper at the site that is wearing a rainbow sweater that is kind of shrouded by a cloud of smoke there in the midground. And this use of the rainbow at Greenham Common, which was in the this particular picture is from 1983, But it's interesting to think about the rainbow as this emerging queer symbol and the way that it was utilized by these campers, a lot of them lesbian separatists on site, in a situation that was quite dangerous. It was a reclamation of their personal identity, and also a message out into the world about peacemaking and about lovemaking. And yes, and so the rainbow as a symbol was first introduced in 78 by and designed by Gilbert Baker. So as a emergent symbol, it had quite a prominence at the site. This is another image of a camper, and she has this rainbow in her armband. And this particular garment is really, really beautiful. I tracked her through, this 1 hour, 4 minutes of this particular video. And you can see her like putting up her tent and helping another woman put up a tent. And she has an image of a skyscape in the daytime on the front, and then a moon in the back. And she's got this rainbow sleeve. And this is another one. I mean, it's been fascinating for me to keep going back and looking into this archival material and seeing different iterations of the same sort of messaging. And also then to see sort of their own homespun, homegrown symbol usage be born and expand and move from one camper to the other. As you can see, garments being shared. This is a painting that I made in 2020. And this is based on another garment from Greenham Common, of a black on black garment where it's a sweater on top of a sweater, both black, and one of them has the evil eye, which is a protective symbol. It's very ancient, of course, and popular throughout many cultures. So the black on black paintings are really difficult and challenging to me, although they're pretty austere. I like the way that it has this austere presence in the space, but making them is challenging in the sense that there's just black paint. And so to come up with a way that the black looks denser and denser and denser when there's just one value of black is reliant on just like a lot of layering and the size of brush strokes. And so this particular painting is one of my favorites in the show, although I think it speaks in one of the quietest voices. And this is the source image for that piece. And then these two paintings are on the far wall, and the piece on the right is the piece that is owned by the ICA. And then the piece on the left with the sweater and the vitrine are new pieces created for the show. This is Amazon Nights, Woman Spirit, Woman Power, Glory. And it features a symbol that was really prominent at Greenham Common as well. It's the Labyrinth symbol. So the Labyrinth, or the double-sided axe, is one of the oldest symbols of Greek civilization. It was thought to be the weapon of choice of Amazon warrior women. And it also was affiliated with Minoan culture, which was a matriarchal culture. So it was important in kind of goddess worship strains of feminism in the 1980s. And it also was a really popular lesbian and feminist strength symbol in the late 70s throughout the 90s. And I still see a lot of use of Labyrinth in the world, but it was the strength symbol that was prominent there. and it was knit into a fair amount of their garments. And so, oh, also the use of the language in the title with the woman spirit spelled Momon instead of the woe of man. There was so much inventive language use and reinvention of the way that we think of words and female words and at the camp. And this is, you can see it in their songbooks, you can see it in the ephemera that came out of the camps. There's a lot of like cartoons about it. And one of the things that I come across when I do go look for images of the sweaters is things like letters that people wrote back and forth to each other, and diaries and calendars. And so there's a way that all of that stuff is really precious to me as well. And it gets utilized sometimes in the titles. A lot of the titles, like the one prior, are from songs, or they're from ephemera like this. So this is really a more inventive spellings of women that are counter patriarchal. Yes, and then this is the source image for the piece that's owned by the ICA. And so she's wearing this Labyrinth sweater, and she also has a Greek key on it, which is this really, again, ancient symbol of a meander, which is symbolic of life, where you kind of go and fold back on yourself and keep a continuing strain. And then she's also wearing a sweater that seems like it's made out of variegated yarn. So that is a fascinating thing for me when I'm painting, to try to figure out a way to translate a variegated image into paint. Because it's random on a yarn skein, I have to come up with a system to make it work in a painting, so that it doesn't, it keeps the strain of change from the light to the dark values. And so the painting has a bit of variegation in it as well. And we'll come to another painting that has a lot of variegation. I can explain more how that's done. You can see the variegation in this a little bit. So it's a strange thing to make a painting that is also reflecting knitting. It's taking one language, two languages that don't historically have a lot to do with one another, and trying to represent a body in a new way. And figuring out a language for the yarn is part of that. And I think that's why I love the variegated paintings so much. So a lot of the variegated ones are use a piece of a sample of yarn to begin with. So I find a yarn that I think would make a variegation like the one that's in the source image, and I knit it, and then I turn it into a mathematical equation. So it's like, 120 light pink, 7 white, 40 dark, orange, and then whatever it is. And then that is my rule code. And then that goes throughout. So it gets really complicated because these paintings have a front and a back of the garment, and then 2 sleeves, and then also sometimes pants, and sometimes also a garment on top of that. So there are these feats of like color math, where I'm counting out them like stitch by stitch sometimes, and each tiny little square is its own equation of color combinations in order to achieve this illusion of transparency, so that a person like me, or a person that wants to try to knit it now or in the future, could actually look and see where shapes start and stop, and where increases happen, where shaping happens in a garment. This is a Fair Isle sweater that has a Labyrinth motif knit into the sleeve. You can see it's like a really simplified one that has a black, white, black, white, black, white, back and forth kind of pattern within the blade aspect of it. This is the very first Greenham Commons sweater that I came across in a book called Greenham Women Everywhere. And it was a book that I picked up after I met a Greenham activist at a commune in New Mexico. It was also a separatist commune. And when I met her, Nick, her name is Nick, her name is Nick, I had never heard of Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp. And so getting this book and starting to familiarize myself with the movement and seeing this hugging image of two women leaving prison, and having the knitting background that I have, I've been knitting since I was a child, and I used to work for Vogue Knitting magazine in the late 90s. It was an epiphany to me that they were using symbols like this labyrinth in such inventive and new ways. I had never seen it used before as a Fair Isle swatch. So it made me open my eyes, and it's an important image to me because it began kind of my process of trying to pull these out from history and save them. This is another example of a labyrinth motif sweater. A person like standing outside of the main gate of the encampment. On the other side of the gate is where all the nuclear cruise missiles are destined to be stored. And you can tell it's a hand-knit garment because it's not symmetrical. There's two different things happening on both sleeves. I also love how dirty it is, just like a filthy, filthy garment. She's clearly been living outside, fighting for peace. And then, like I was saying before, there's so many interesting things that happened in terms of symbol usage and the crafting of self-identification at the camp. And this is like such a gorgeous sweater that I found right before COVID start. I was able to go to England one last time for research, and I met with this woman named Janine Wydell, who was a photographer at Greenham, and she had this stack of contact sheets that she let me come over to her house and sit on her kitchen table and look through them. And she said that nobody had touched them for 30 years. And I just like, there were so many pieces of knitwear in there. And when I told her what I was doing, she said that she didn't think I'd find anything. And I think that has been my experience in doing this research, is that it was a piece of the creative piece of this movement that was overlooked. Right now, there's a book that just came out of the banners that were made at Greenham Common. It just came out last November. And it's great that that particular aspect of their creative making is being investigated. And I'm hoping that the fact that there were so many unrecognized artists at that camp, and so many women that were unrecognized artists at the time, I hope that is starting to change for sure. So this particular sweater, you can see there is a little labyrinth right at the elbow. There's also a peace sign. There's a women's symbol, pictogram. There's this beautiful spider web, and it looks like there's an iris flower within that. There's lunar moons. There's just like so much going on. So gorgeous. So this painting in the show is called Erica XO, and it's based on the source image has like partial language in it that could be Erica. So because there's Gloria in the show, and because of the submerged man, I wanted to have there be another presence of a name. And so this is Erica XO. The XO comes from the source image. It's clear that there's this plate or this cable that goes through the front of the jacket. And so I created it as a XO cable. So it has this voice of love and care as an XOXO, which everyone knows what that means, but it's also instilled into the very knitting, and we'll see that in a second. And there's also all these flowers, and there was quite a beautiful use of flowers at the camp as symbol in knitwear. This is the source image. It's terrible, it's crappy, but you can see the KA, you can see the flowers, you can see that there's a plate that goes down the front. And then this is the garment. And I think you can see it, the detail of it better in the next slide. Yeah, can you see the XO? It's within the red. And then again, this vitrine is the same scale and dimensions as the Gober grate in the floor. This is a photograph that was in a Greenham Common archive at the People's History Museum in Manchester. And it is such a wide-ranging presentation of symbology. There's like the dove and text, and there's a barbed wire fence and a cruise missile, and there's flowers, and there's a peace flower on the person on the right. And I wanted to reiterate this floral use and beautiful nature being a presentation of the very antithesis of something like a nuclear holocaust, and also for the campers that were living outside on one side of a barbed wire fence that was on the other side very, very austere and kind of the penultimate military presence, with the land completely stripped away in order to lay the concrete for the largest runway in Europe. And all of these bunkers, there was nature on one side and there was this terrible military civilization on the other. And then this is the final wall of the exhibition. So these are the 3 paintings on the long wall. And then this is Mourning, the Land of Faminia. And it has that variegated paint that represents variegated yarn, which is also this strange mathematical equation that is laid on top of each other, on top of each other, on top of each other in it. It also has the Mourning armband. So this is a detail of the variegation. This one, this source image had these blips of chrome. And so it was important that it had like reiterative, really small chromatic blips in this particular variegation. So there's something visually very activated about that. And then this is the source image camper on the left with the armband and the cap, and the variegation you can see on the sleeve is this blip. Other armbands at Greenham Common. This is from the Jane Bone archive, which she was a photographer for The Guardian. And this particular image is so appealing to me. She seems so distraught, and has a female pictograph on the lapel or in the front. And then there's another image of this by Jane Bone that I've found that has her included in it, that has the back of the sweater, and that has rows of female pictographs along the top. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important thing to say about my practice as well, is that these sweaters are found by me in archives or photographed from films or videos, but a lot of times they're just partial and I don't see what's going on in the entire garment, what the entire message is, until I do additional research. And sometimes I find more images of fronts or backs or sleeves, or maybe in color where it was just in black and white. This is a good example of that. This painting is Doves in the Crosshairs, and it includes the pants and the front and the back and the sleeves, and also a scarf. And this motif of like crosshairs on a rifle, and then also doves on the sleeves, which if you go to the next slide, for the longest time, this was the only image that I had of this garment, and it looked, I didn't even really see that those were crosshairs. It just looked kind of abstract and potentially metaphysical, the way that there were things that were growing from centers and maybe orbs, maybe like rays. But it seemed like there was something there, something that was potentially communicative. So I kind of kept it close. And then when I was at Janine Weidels in 2019, on her kitchen table, I came across the next image, which is the same sweater you can see, but you can see more detail of it. So you can see that is in fact a crosshair, and you can see that that is like a strange kind of ray centered motif in the mid section, but you can also see that it's doves on the sleeves, which with like this kind of billowy tail and wings. So beautiful. So then I was able to make that painting. Next painting, next one. And doves had this real prominence at Greenham Common too as a symbol in their knitwear. So, I mean, doves have had significant sense, like biblical use in regards to like a dove being a messenger of peace or love. But at the first International Peace Conference in Paris in, I believe it was 49, Picasso was commissioned to make a drawing for the conference, and he created a dove. I think he was commissioned because he had done Guernica a decade prior. And yeah, I mean, I think the peace movement and the campaign for nuclear disarmament, or the CND in particular, kind of took off with that symbolism. But doves at Greenham on banners is giant too. So it's this communicative language that goes from one medium to another and then onto bodies. And here's another one. Here's another beautiful, beautiful garment with the music notes. There was so much creative making at Greenham Common. They thought of it, creative making, as this opposition to war making and an opposition to violence. So it kind of transcended into so many mediums, including songwriting and singing. If you look up Greenham Common, like on YouTube, and you see some footage, you'll see that they're so often engaged in song, and the songs are written by them, or they rewrote the songs of other people, or instilled their voices in some more kind of traditional peace songwriting. And yeah, the representation of their own subjectivity as these protesting female bodies is very, very, very present in the songs. They're very moving. Oh my gosh, one more. I'm sorry, I can't stop with these. These images are new to me because of my last trip there, and there was just like there were so many, and they were so incredible. So this is another dove, and it has a woman's pictograph within it. And it seems like it's worn by the same woman that wore the one with the dove on the elbows that's in the painting, if the faces are the same. And then this is the last painting in the show. We are changers, and everything we touch can change. And that text is, the title is from a Greenham song. So this is a more traditional kind of Fair Isle sweater with different symbol use going on in different kind of color rows. And here is a detail of it. And this is a good way to talk about the idea of that color math that I was talking about. So if you have, say you have that black or that brown and white kind of interrupted rickrack that's going all the way through to the end of the sleeve, and then you have the figure going over it, and then you also have what's going on in the back of the sweater, which is the breast going over that. It's like there's, and then also she was wearing overalls, so there's these gray overalls that are going over everything and desaturating everything. So it's just like so many different things going on that need to maintain their I guess continuity in order to read it as a shape that stops and starts. And then if you see the gray overalls in the background, and that's the sweater, you can track the symbols that are in the painting with that garment. And the fact that it's in color is so nice too, because you get that factual relationship. And then that is the show. Final installation image with the one newspaper painting on the short wall not seen here. And that is it.
Thank you so much, Ellen. This was fantastic. And I think we have a couple of questions actually, but before we dive in, I just wanted to say that it's so interesting to see how much, I mean, this incredibly meticulous and years long research that you're doing through these archives, really like talking to the protesters and meeting them in their homes and really digging up so much material. But then actually what I find so interesting is where the part of like kind of imagining or interpreting actually sets in, where you say there's sometimes you see one sleeve or only a back or a side, and kind of this practice of continuing the archive through imagination to kind of actually what cannot be documented one-on-one, to just fill in there with your artistic license, so to say, or as an artist to kind of continue to kind of fill the archives where there's voids and blanks.
Thank you. Yeah, it's I have given myself, I used to be really more strict about like the rules, I guess. Like all artists have these rules of engagement with their work, and I have like allowed myself to extrapolate more recently, and that there's pleasure in that, and there's pleasure in feeling like I've familiarized myself with the language enough that that I can do that.
Yeah, and I can only recommend again your book Velvet Fist, because it also has this fantastic glossary that just shows all the different symbols and where they come from. And you explained a lot about the Labyrinth that is in the ICA Miami piece, but there's so many more.
There's like dozens and dozens.
No, it's incredible, the reading. So, and maybe what you just said already answered one of our guests' questions, which was, what is the correlation between the sweaters from photos and your interpretation in your art form? So yeah, you said you just take actually more liberties now to.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of information that you can get from an archival image, even if it's just a partial image. Like you can see, I mean, at least there's a lot of information that I can take, so, or a knitter can take. You can see what kind of gauge the yarn is. You can see how thick or thin it is, and that relates to the size of the grid that I make. You can see the shaping of it. So you can see, like, is it a set-in sleeve? Is it an oversized like sleeve? Is it a raglan sleeve? What's the neck? Is it a V-neck? I mean, all of those things create the shapes of the painting. So that shapeliness of the painting is transcribed from the source as well. So the shapes come first, and then they get filled, and the chromes are either there or they're translated from black and white. And then a lot of information gets filled in based on the images, and then some of the information gets filled in that's not there ultimately.
Yeah, and I feel this also connects to another guest's question, which is, can you speak to how you arrived at translating these knitted garments into flat pattern paintings? Because it seems that your primary interest and passion is the craft and history of the knitted garments themselves and what those garments represent. So I'm curious to hear more about how you arrived at turning them into paintings.
I mean, I have a painting background. And I was a figurative oil painter as a student. And then I think as I got more cognizant of the history of figuration, I felt really self-conscious, I felt it wasn't possible for me to represent my body or a female subject using that particular, I guess, medium with its history inherent up within its use. And so I didn't paint for years and years and years. I did other things. I did performative work. I did costume making. I did photography. I did writing. And it wasn't until I came upon creative direct action of sweaters where I saw an into a new way to present a body that was divorced from that history, and that was based on American symbol craft, which is the language of knit patterning. And like, if you look in the back of a knit pattern book, what I do is, just a couple steps removed from what those instructional templates look like. So the knitting was there, but the painting was there too, really early on, and it took a long time for the two to merge together. It took 20 years of being an artist, honestly.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And actually, there's another question that also relates to that. And one of our guests is asking about how the practice of painting engages with your interest in reimagining or invoking the practice of this particular moment in time or form of protests. And I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly. And it says, what do you think about this provocation? So reimagining the practice and the forms of protests in your work.
I mean, I'm not sure if I understand the question entirely either, and maybe I'm going to answer this the wrong way, but I'm going to take a stab at what came to my mind, and that is that for formulating in 2022, formulating a relationship with figurative painting is a really fraught endeavor. And I think that, what was the last word in that question?
A provocation.
I think it is a provocation for me to imagine that the work that I do is painting. I mean, I think it's a provocation for some people, and historically would definitely have been a provocation. The fact that they're paintings, people always ask me, are they paintings or are they drawings? And I always say that they're paintings, but they're on paper. And I mean, there's rules of engagement historically with painting, and to step outside of that dialogue and to try to do this instead with painting, I think is a provocation. And I don't know if that's the sense of that question, but I do relate to that.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, on a different level, also dialoguing with this movement in the 80s is really interesting. And one other guest said that it's really intriguing how you take the sweaters that the protesters wear and make this important statement and transcribing them into your skill as a knitter as well as an artist, and to just take on this very different perspective on their work. And I think actually when you were in Miami and for the opening of your show, I remember you said something really interesting, that you also, through your art, you really feel like you can incorporate these archives and these protests, and especially forms of women's protest and female protest, and kind of give them another life, or kind of incorporate them into another form of archiving. For instance, when your work is acquired by museums and enters collections, this whole history of Greenham Commons kind of comes with it.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that is the initial draw, the initial draw in 2005 when I met Nick and I didn't know about Greenham Common, and I felt shame in that as a, kind of women's studies person in the past. And then researching it and seeing this knitting history there too, and then recognizing that there were so many people of women in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even now, prior for sure, that were artists that were overlooked. And these particular sweaters being so complicated aesthetically and formally and conceptually, and having them just be on nobody's radar, I felt it was incumbent on me to do that piecing back together. Yeah, I mean, I in all the years that I've been looking for these sources, I have not found a single sweater, so they don't exist. And I think that plucking things out of history sometimes is the work that we could be doing and we should be doing.
Yeah, so that's kind of something almost like the holy grail, to find one of these sweaters.
Yeah, I know.
So there was another question that I thought was interesting, and which is, can you talk a bit about the collective efforts through the paintings, the gathering of the garments, and when a particular gathering is complete for you? So
what were you going to say?
Sorry, just to add how I read the question is maybe also do you feel that the whole Greenham Commons project, is there a point of completion for you, or?
Oh, I mean, I'm interested in looking at other things as well, but I do feel like there is more work of archiving to be done. There are more archives that I know of. Like, I feel like I get connected with people and with archives, and I know that there's more to be seen and to be looked through. And so I think it's important that I keep that thread kind of alive and keep doing that work. That I also have an interest in kind of peace women knitwear beyond Greenham Common. There were other peace activists and other encampments that were inspired by Greenham Common that happened in the 80s and in the 90s, all through the world, really. There were particularly two in Australia that I'm really, really interested in researching. So I'm hoping to do that work. I'm also really interested in knitting designers from that era and prior, especially women that were kind of, that we would never know their name, but they were super busy and inspired, and kind of looking at their work again and trying to hold it up for other people to see. So those are some other things I'm interested in.
And are you mostly focusing on historical protests, or do you also engage with more contemporary examples of protests?
I do. I mean, it's really, I think the era of knitting being a craft that a fair amount of people know and engage in is sort of over, and mass-produced textiles has entered the picture. It's harder than you imagine to find an argumentative textile that's worn in a contemporary setting. I mean, every once in a while I will see one, every once in a while, but it's not easy. Yeah.
Great.
Protesters are using other things. They're doing other things. It's not about knitwear anymore. Yeah.
Okay, maybe one last question here. There's a comment, or maybe a comment that says, when I view photos from various moments throughout history, it will make me want to discover common elements that is worn by protesters.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, people know about protest songs, I think, more than anything, and also just the messaging. But creative direct action and the visual kind of making of various movements is super fascinating to research. super fascinating. It's based on like for the particular skills of a group. It's based on like what they had access to in terms of material, but it's also very, very inspired and has everything to do with aesthetics and with messaging. Yeah.
I think that's a great way to close this talk. I would like to thank you and our audiences. Thank you, Ellen, for sharing your work, and everybody else, thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you to the entire team at the ICA Miami, particularly Daniela Granadillo, our digital producer, who has been running this event for us. And please come visit ICA to see Ellen Lesperance show Amazon Nights, that is still up till March 27th. And thank you again, Ellen.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And our next event is ICA Performs with Adam Weinert's Dance of the Ages next Friday. So please, for tickets and information, check out our website. And thank you again.
Thanks.